The chamber was built for gods. That was the only way Commander Yale Dross could describe it. The ceiling stretched so high that the lights near the top looked like distant stars. The seats curved in wide rings, hundreds of them, filled with bodies of every shape the universe had bothered to invent. Some had 4 arms. Some had no visible arms at all. One delegation in the far left ring breathed through membranes that pulsed like jellyfish in open water. The smell was something between rain and burning copper. Dross stood at the podium. It was sized for something 8 feet tall. She was 5'6" on a good day. She adjusted the microphone anyway. The Galactic Conclave had been in operation for over 4,000 years. Earth had received its invitation 11 months ago. A thin white transmission, cold and formal, delivered to the UN Secretariat by a drone that left no return address. The message had said, in 63 languages, "You may attend. Speak when spoken to." Earth had spent 11 months preparing its response. Dross tapped the display panel on the podium and brought up the fleet inventory. It loaded in clean white columns across the main screen. 214 mid-class frigates, 40 cruisers, 11 carriers, a support grid of 300 auxiliary craft. Combat record, 2 engagements, both defensive, both resolved without territorial loss. She let them read it. The sound started small, a low vibration from the Vorath section, 3rd ring from the center. The Vorath were ancient, 7-limbed with gray skin the texture of old bark, and eyes that sat too far apart on a face that had never learned to perform anything as trivial as kindness. Their translator rendered most of their speech in a register that landed somewhere between lecture and funeral oration. Their delegate, who had held his seat on the conclave for 60 human years, looked at Earth's numbers and made a sound like gravel spinning inside a metal drum. The translator said, "Adorable." It spread. The Keth hegemony's military attaché, a tall, pale creature with 4 fingers on each hand, and the kind of stillness that belongs to things that had survived long enough to stop moving, unless they mean it, pulled up Earth's combat record on his own screen, and read through it with an expression that gave nothing away. The Tulhari delegation simply watched. The Sen did not react at all, but the Vorath laughed, and 3 other species joined them, and the sound filled the cathedral chamber like something large and contemptuous settling into its chair. Dross did not move. She stood at the podium sized for something she was not, and she listened to them laugh, and she did not grip the edge of the podium, and she did not look at her shoes, and she did not perform dignity, because dignity, she had decided at roughly age 14, was something you only needed to perform when you didn't already have it. She had it. She looked at the Vorath delegate until he stopped laughing. It took a while. When he did, he spread 3 of his arms in the gesture that the briefing packet had told her meant, "Continue, small thing." Dross made 1 note on her datapad. A set of coordinates. 3 words. She transmitted it to Earth. Then she stepped back from the podium, sat down in the chair behind it, and poured herself a glass of water from the carafe that some aide had thoughtfully placed at floor level, since the table was also sized for something 8 feet tall. The Keth attaché watched her sit. He watched her drink the water. He watched her look at nothing in particular, with the expression of a woman who had already finished an argument that the room didn't know had started yet. He made a note of his own. 40 light minutes away, something woke up. It had been asleep, or the closest thing to sleep that a machine could manage, kept in low-power hibernation in the shadow of Neptune's orbit, tucked behind a sensor masking array that had cost more than the GDP of 4 mid-tier nations, and had been listed in the UN budget under the line item, Infrastructure Maintenance, Category 7 Omega, duration, indefinite. Category 7 Omega had been created 14 years after the Keth raid on Europa Colony. The raid itself had lasted 9 hours. The colony had a population of 40,000. It had a militia of 212. The militia had fought well, which meant the dying had taken longer than it otherwise would have. By the time Earth's nearest response fleet arrived, there was a debris field where a city had been. There were no survivors. There was one transmission, recorded in the last 4 minutes of the colony's life, sent on a frequency that nobody had used in 30 years, and that the Keth had not thought to jam, because they did not know anyone still used it. The UN Security Council had listened to that transmission in a closed session. All 14 votes in favor of Category 7 Omega had been cast in silence. Nobody had spoken after the vote. They had simply filed out of the chamber one by one and gone to do what needed to be done. 40 years. That was what it took. Not because humans were slow, because the thing they were building had never been built before by anyone anywhere, and the first 7 designs had failed at the simulation stage, and the 8th had nearly taken out a test platform, and the engineers had spent 3 years alone in the dark, arguing about physics that the rest of the galaxy had not discovered yet, or had discovered and quietly decided not to pursue. The ship was called the UNSS Unconditional. It was 4.2 kilometers long. Its hull was black, not painted black, not coated, but built dark, layer by layer, from materials that absorbed light the way grief absorbs everything else. Quietly, completely, with no visible change in the surface. It had weapons that the Conclave sensors would not recognize as weapons, because they were not technically weapons in any configuration that had been catalogued. Its reactor ran on a process that 3 separate alien scientific bodies had theorized separately was impossible. Its crew of 940 treated it like home, because it was. Most of them had been aboard for 3 years or more. They had birthdays on it. Some of them had gotten married. Captain Oren Vale had a thermos of bad coffee his daughter had painted for him when she was 6. She was 22 now. He still used the thermos. When the Unconditional powered on, 40 light minutes from the Galactic Conclave's primary station, every sensor array in the region registered the power signature at the same moment. 6 different alien monitoring systems screamed simultaneously. The signal was not a weapon lock. It was not a targeting pulse. It was simply the sound of something very large opening its eyes. The Vorath sensor operator who picked it up first sat with her hands motionless above her console for 11 full seconds. In Vorath military culture, 11 seconds of silence from a trained sensor operator was the equivalent of standing up and screaming. She screamed anyway. Back in the chamber, the gravel laugh had long faded. Dross finished her water. She set the glass down. The Vorath delegate had turned to speak to his aide about something, already moving on, already cataloging this meeting as a footnote in the minor history of a species not worth the attention. Her datapad vibrated once. 2 words. En route. She did not smile. She was not a woman who smiled at moments that called for it. She smiled at bad jokes and strong coffee, and the specific expression her second-in-command made when the ship's printer ran out of paper. Those were things worth smiling at. This was not a moment for smiling. This was a moment for sitting very still and letting the universe figure out, on its own, that it had made an error in judgment. She poured herself a second glass of water and waited. The Vorath fleet was 900 vessels. Not 900 small ones, not 900 patrol craft or scouts, or the kind of ships that empires sent to places they did not fully care about. 900 warships, each one older than any nation currently operating on Earth. Each one carrying weapons that had been tested in real wars against real enemies and had not been found lacking. The Vorath had not lost a military engagement in 600 years. They kept count. They were proud of the number the way old families are proud of portraits, not because the portraits are beautiful, but because there are so many of them. When the UNSS Unconditional dropped into conclave space, the Vorath fleet went silent. Every channel, every command frequency, every automated alert system that should have triggered, every protocol that should have fired, every voice that should have given orders. Silence. 900 ships and not a single transmission for 11 full seconds. 11 seconds. Admiral Vorath 7, commander of the Conclave's outer security cordon, and a creature who had directed fleet actions across 4 star systems, sat in his command chair and looked at the thing on his display, and did not move. His hands, all 7 of them, rested flat on the armrests. His staff watched him. They were waiting for an order. He was not giving one. He was thinking about the number 4.2. 4.2 kilometers. He had been in space for most of his adult life, and he knew, in the bone-deep way that military men know things, what 4.2 kilometers of warship looked like. What it meant in terms of weapons load, reactor output, crew capacity, and the political will required to build and move and aim a thing that large. He had never seen one. Nobody in the Conclave had ever seen one. The Vorath had a word, used rarely, for the feeling of encountering something that should not exist, according to your understanding of what is possible. It translated poorly into most languages. The closest human equivalent was something between humbling and the bottom falling out. Admiral Vorath 7 used that word, quietly, to himself. He still gave no orders. Captain Oren Vale was drinking bad coffee when they crossed the threshold into Conclave space. The coffee was cold. It had been cold for 20 minutes, because the bridge had been busy, and he had not gotten back to it. He drank it cold anyway. The thermos his daughter had painted was red and yellow, with a lopsided sun on the side, and the words "Best Daddy" in letters that curved downhill, because she had run out of room. He had not told her about the spelling. He had used the thermos every day since she gave it to him. He stood at the forward viewport, and looked at what was in front of them. Conclave Station was enormous. The kind of enormous that doesn't announce itself, that you just keep adjusting to, like a horizon that keeps moving back. Hundreds of docked ships, running lights in a dozen color frequencies, traffic patterns that had been in place for longer than most Earth civilizations had existed. And surrounding it now that the unconditional had arrived, a cluster of Vorath ships that had stopped moving and were simply sitting in space and pointing at them. Vale drank his cold coffee. His first officer, Lieutenant Commander Petra Hong, appeared at his shoulder. She had the look she always got before things became complicated. Focused in the way a person focuses when they are deliberately not thinking about the part that might go badly. "Vorath fleet is not moving," she said. "I see that. They've been in position for 11 seconds. I know. I know what it means." He lowered the thermos. "It means we have their attention." He turned from the viewport and walked back to his command station. The unconditional held position. It did not power up weapons. It did not run any targeting system. It simply sat in space at its full, unambiguous 4.2 kilometers, and let the light of the nearest star hit its dark hull and do what light does when it meets something that does not give it back. Vale thought about Europa Colony, not in any detailed way. He did not let himself do that on the bridge. He thought about it the way you think about a scar, briefly, functionally, as information rather than memory. The colony, the vote, the 40 years, the 900 engineers who had signed non-disclosure agreements that covered everything, including the shape of their work schedule. The 3 design teams that had burned out completely and been quietly rotated home. The 8-year argument about the second configuration. The test that had nearly gone wrong in a way that would have removed a small moon from the solar system. All of it, sitting here. In this hall, black as grief and twice as patient. A transmission request came in. Vorath military band. He accepted it. The Admiral's face filled the screen, gray-barked skin, eyes too far apart. All 7 hands, Vale noticed, now gripping the armrests. "Unidentified vessel." The translator was good. It caught the edge in the voice. "State your designation and your intent." Vale set down his thermos. "UNSS Unconditional," he said. "Earth's first Titan-class warship. I'm Captain Oren Vale." He paused the precise length of time that a man pauses when he is not nervous and wants the other party to understand that. "We're here to rejoin the conversation." The screen held the Admiral's face for 4 seconds. Then it cut out. On the station, in the medical bay she had claimed as her temporary office, because the guest quarters were sized for something 8 feet tall. Dross heard the name Unconditional come through on the open comm channel, and she set down her datapad, and she looked at the ceiling for a moment. 40 years was a long time to carry a secret. The weight of it had not been the secrecy itself. She had kept secrets before. The weight had been the knowing. Knowing what they were building, what it meant, what they were saying with it, not in words but in steel and reactor cores, and the specific kind of engineering that only comes out of a species that has been hurt badly enough and waited long enough, and is calm enough now to be precise about it. She had been 23 when Europa happened. She had known people there. Not many. 2. A research contact she had met at a conference, a woman named Dara, who had worked in atmospheric systems, and sent funny messages about the local weather, which on Europa mostly meant the underground temperature differential and the way the ice moved. Dara had not survived. Dross had become a diplomat because she believed in talking. She still believed in talking. She believed in it the way doctors believe in medicine. Not naively, not without knowing what medicine cannot fix, but with the steady and professional conviction that it is better than the alternative, and that you do not abandon it just because it has failed before. But she also believed in leverage, and the unconditional was leverage. Not because of what it would destroy, because of what it prevented from needing to be destroyed, because of the 11 seconds of silence it had already bought, because the Admiral had asked a question, which meant he was thinking, and thinking men do not fire first. She picked up her datapad and went back to work. In the Vorath fleet, the silence had broken. Orders were being given now, clipped and precise. Ships moving to adjusted positions. Sensor arrays refocusing. Analysts pulling every piece of data they had on Earth's building programs, Earth's manufacturing capacity, Earth's budget allocations for the last 4 decades. All of it running through systems that were very good at finding what was there. They found nothing useful. Category 7 Omega had been airtight. What they had was what everyone now had, the shape of the thing in front of them. 4.2 kilometers of it. The heat signature, the power output, the hull geometry that did not match any configuration in the Conclave's database, and the Conclave's database was 4,000 years old and had entries from 61 civilizations. One analyst, Young, third posting, ran the hull geometry through 3 different classification systems, trying to force a match. She got the same result each time. Unknown type, no analogous record. She flagged it and sent it up the chain. Then she sat for a moment, looking at the screen, and she thought about the word her admiral had used. Quietly, to himself. The one that translated poorly. She understood it now. She wrote it in her log, and then after a moment, deleted it. Some things you understand in your body first. The words come later, or not at all. The unconditional held position, and did not fire a single weapon, and did not move, and did not speak again, and somehow, in the total stillness of a 4.2 kilometer ship, doing absolutely nothing, that was the most military thing it had done yet. The Shoal Collective did not introduce themselves. They arrived in the Harak system, a neutral star system, 3 habitable worlds, home to about 9 million people, belonging to 4 different Conclave member species. And they began. That was the only word for it. Not attacked, not invaded. They began, the way a fire begins, without announcement and without interest in your opinion of the matter. 6 Conclave member fleets responded. They came from different directions, at different speeds, with different weapons and different command structures, and 72 hours later, there was a debris field where 6 fleets had been. The Conclave convened an emergency session. Dross sat in her chair, the one sized for something 8 feet tall, and she listened to 6 hours of panic, dressed up as procedure. Species who had been calm and ancient and slow to move for centuries were suddenly moving very fast and saying very little of use. The Vorath, who had found their voice again after the initial shock of the Unconditional's arrival, argued for a strategic retreat. The Keth hegemony proposed negotiation. 3 other delegations proposed negotiation with the Keth. 2 delegations proposed negotiating with the Shoal directly, which was the kind of proposal that gets made by people who have not seen the debris field yet. Dross did not speak during this session. She was watching. She was watching the way a person watches a room when they already know what is going to happen in it, and are simply waiting for the room to catch up. The vote came down. Tactical withdrawal. Seed the Harak system. Open communication channels. Wait. Dross abstained. On the way out of the chamber, she sent a single message to the unconditional. Captain's discretion. Vale read the message at 0340 station time. He had not been asleep. He had been sitting on the bridge, with his cold coffee and his lopsided thermos, reading the tactical reports from Harak, the way a surgeon reads a chart, not with emotion, with attention. The debris field, the weapon signatures, the attack vectors, the speed. Captain's discretion was 3 words from Earth Command. It was also, if you understood what it meant, the longest and most complicated set of orders ever given. It meant, we trust you. It meant, we cannot tell you from here, and we will not try. It meant, you know what we built this for, and you know who we built it for, and there is a system, with 9 million people in it, and the math is very simple, Captain, and we know you already did the math. He set down the thermos. Helm, he said, plot a course for Harak. They arrived 6 hours later. The debris field was enormous. Vale stood at the viewport for a long time, and looked at it. Pieces of 6 fleets, all different shapes, all the same silence. Metal that had been ships 12 hours ago. He thought about Europa the way he always thought about it, briefly, as information, and then he stopped. Sir, Hoang said from his right. Shoal formation at 320, approximately 400 vessels. I see them. They're in attack formation. I see that too. The Shoal ships were ugly in the way that purely functional things are ugly. No consideration for anything except the purpose. They were dark and angular and bristling with weapons arrays that the unconditional systems were already mapping and categorizing and cross-referencing. They had torn through 6 fleets in 3 days. They were not, Vale noticed, moving to engage. They were watching. Everyone, today, was watching. Engineering, Vale said into the ship-wide comm. It's time. A pause, then the chief engineer's voice, dry and flat in the way of a woman who has been awake for 22 hours and has stopped performing composure. Second configuration, in 4 minutes. On a Kef military vessel, at the edge of the Harak system. Damaged, running at 30% power, waiting for rescue that might not come. A military observer named Soft Caravan had positioned herself at the only working external camera and was recording everything. Her name would not appear in any history book for another 60 years. Then it would appear in all of them. She watched the unconditional, and she was honest enough, in the private record of her own mind, to admit that she had expected something dramatic. A weapon charging, a targeting signal, the kind of prelude that large ships give before they do something that changes the outcome of things. The unconditional gave no prelude. It simply changed. The hull moved, not the way a ship moves through space, the way a living thing moves. Plates separated, smoothly and without sound, and pulled back from the core structure in patterns that the eye tried to track and couldn't because there were too many moving parts, and they were all moving at once. The core of the ship grew leaner, exposed. What had been a single 4.2-kilometer vessel became something that did not have a clean word in any language Soft Caravan knew. The separated hull sections did not drift. They stabilized, each one locked into a position relative to the core, spreading outward in a pattern that Soft Caravan's tactical training tried to classify and failed. Not a formation, not a spread, something more like a nervous system. The sections were not separate ships. They were still the unconditional. Still one thing, just a thing that had decided to stop having a single location. She counted 14 hull sections, each one armed, each one moving independently, precisely, guided by a central system that was clearly coordinating all of them as one. The Shoal fleet fired first. They were not slow about it. 400 ships, everything they had, in the first 30 seconds. The volume of fire that had destroyed 6 fleets in 3 days compressed into a single coordinated strike. It hit something. It hit a lot of things. 2 hull sections took damage. 1 retreated briefly, rotated, returned. The rest moved. Not retreated, not defended, moved. The pattern shifted. The geometry the Schul fleet had targeted was no longer the geometry that existed. The unconditional in second configuration was not a thing you could aim at, because the thing you aimed at was not there by the time the shot arrived. South Caravan understood tactics. She had studied them for 30 years. She watched the engagement, and she felt something cold and careful move through her, and she thought, they designed this specifically for numbers. 400 ships built to overwhelm through mass and volume. Against a single target, mass and volume were the correct weapon. Against a distributed system that moved as one organism and made numbers irrelevant, there was no doctrine. There was no counter-strategy. It had not been invented yet, because no one had needed to invent it. The Schul fleet lasted 40 minutes. Not destroyed, defeated. Vale's standing orders, which South Caravan did not know at the time, were damage and disable, not annihilate. Enough to stop, not more. She would find out about those orders later, when they were made part of the official record. She would think about them for a long time. Then the unconditional reconfigured again. The hull sections pulled back. The core thickened. The ship became a ship again. One location, one hull, one dark body in the debris field it had just changed the character of. And then it turned. Not toward the damaged Schul vessels, not toward the station, toward the debris of the 6 conclave fleets. It began broadcasting on every medical and emergency frequency simultaneously. Search and rescue operation. All surviving personnel activate beacon signals. Unconditional medical teams deploying in 4 minutes. South Caravan stared at the screen. She stayed there for a long time. The rescue shuttles went out. The medical teams worked through the debris field with the systematic precision of people who had trained for exactly this. Who had, she would later learn, trained for it before they had ever trained for the combat. Because someone had decided, 40 years ago, and every year since, that the ship would know how to save before it knew how to fight. She opened her log. She wrote 1 sentence. She closed the log. She did not write anything else that day. There was nothing else that needed to be said. In the conclave chamber, the news arrived in pieces. The Herak system secured. The Schul fleet disabled and retreating. The rescue operations underway. 900 survivors pulled from debris that everyone had assumed held nothing alive. The chamber was quiet. Not the quiet of shock. The quiet of people who have been very loud for a very long time, and have just been shown, plainly and without commentary, that they were solving the wrong problem. Dross sat in her chair. She did not look at the screen. She was looking at the Voraf delegate, who was sitting very still with all 7 hands in his lap, looking at nothing in particular, with an expression that she had not seen on a Voraf face before. That was interesting. In 11 months of conclave sessions, she had catalogued 37 distinct Voraf facial expressions. This was not one of them. She catalogued it now. She filed it under, learning something for the first time. In South Caravan's log, the 1 sentence read, "They built a god and taught it to stop." She meant it as a tactical observation, a note about doctrine, a statement of military fact. It turned out to be all of those things, and also the first line of a history book, and the title of an opera, and eventually the inscription on a monument on a world that had not yet been settled on the day she wrote it. But that was later. For now it was just 1 sentence in a damaged ship's log, and the rescue shuttles were still going out, and the debris field was very large, and there was a great deal of work left to do. The politics came next. The way politics always come. After the fire is out, when everyone is standing in the ash, arguing about whose fault the fire was. 3 species submitted formal applications for Earth's military protection within a week of Harak. The applications were detailed and sincere, and written in the specific language of entities who had been frightened badly enough to set aside the problem of admitting it. The Tulhari, who had not spoken during the initial session when the Voroth laughed, sent their request through back channels first, and then formally. A careful, 2-step move that told Dross everything she needed to know about how they operated, and how frightened they actually were. 2 species submitted formal motions to limit Earth's military capacity. The motions were detailed and sincere, and written in the specific language of entities who had been frightened badly enough to want to make the frightening thing smaller without having to ask it to be smaller directly. The Voroth submitted nothing. They said nothing. They attended every session. They voted on procedural matters with their usual efficiency. They contributed to the general fund for Harak reconstruction. They did everything they normally did. They simply did not, in any official capacity, acknowledge the unconditional at all. Dross found this considerably more interesting than the formal motions. She tracked it. She watched the Voroth delegate the way she watched everything, without appearing to watch it, and she noted the 11 expressions she had not catalogued before Harak, and she filed them all under the same heading: an old species meeting a new problem. Senna Marsh was 29 years old, and it was her first posting, and she had been on the station for 3 months, and she was going to have to speak in the conclave chamber in 4 days. She knew this because Dross had told her, quietly, in the medical bay that served as Dross's office, in the middle of what had appeared to be a routine briefing. "You'll deliver Earth's formal position on the protection requests and the limitation motions," Dross had said, in the same tone she used for everything, level, direct, unhurried. "I'll have the briefing packet ready tomorrow," Marsh had said, me. Not a question, just the word, sitting there, doing the work of a much longer sentence. "You," Dross confirmed. "I do it myself, but I have other things to attend to." The medical bay was the first thing Marsh noticed. Then, that Dross was in the medical bay, that there was a drip line running to her left arm, and a monitor on the table that had been turned face down, and that there were more medication bottles on the shelf behind her than there had been a month ago. Marsh did not say anything about this. She was learning, in the slow and expensive way that people learn things they are not explicitly taught, what Dross was, and what Dross required of the people around her. Dross required competence. She required honesty. She required that you not treat her like something fragile, when she had not asked to be treated that way. Marsh had 3 months of practice at this. She was getting better. "I'll be ready," she said. She went back to her quarters, and sat on her bunk and looked at the wall for a while. Then she pulled up the briefing packet, which was not ready yet, because Dross had said tomorrow, and she started building it herself. On the unconditional, Vale had received a request for a personal visit and had accepted it, because when Commander Dross sent a request, it was not actually a request. She arrived in the early evening by station time, moving carefully, which was new. She sat in the chair across from his desk, and she looked around the small office he had claimed, the thermos on the corner of the desk, the photograph of his daughter pinned above the monitor, the tactical display still running in the corner, because he had never found the habit of turning it off. "You should see a real doctor," he said. "I am seeing a real doctor. I mean a different one. I mean I'm not interested in that conversation." His daughter had her father's jaw and her mother's eyes, and was, in the photo, holding a fish that was nearly as large as she was, with the expression of someone who has just accomplished something deeply satisfying. "She's still fishing?" "Every summer. She sends photos." "Good." Dross looked back at him. "How's the crew?" He thought about it honestly. "Steady. Harak they did well. They're thinking about the rescue side more than the combat side. That tells me something." "Tells me something too." He poured her coffee. Not good coffee. The unconditional ran on the same procurement system as every other Earth vessel, and the coffee was consistently terrible. But she took it and drank it without comment, which was the closest Dross got to gratitude for small things. She had a datapad in her pocket. She pulled it out and worked on it while they talked. He had seen her do this before. The ability to run 2 conversations at once, 2 tracks of thought, never dropping either one. The limitation motions, he said. They're frightened. We're not going to accept them. Of course not, but I understand them. She finished a note and looked up. Frightened things do stupid things, and then you have to deal with the consequences of the stupid things, which takes longer than just letting them be frightened for a while. She paused. The Vorath are the interesting ones. Silence. Yes, she looked at the tactical display in the corner. 600 years without a military loss, and then an 11-second pause. She was quiet for a moment. They're not going to be enemies. They're also not going to be friends. They're going to watch for a very long time, and eventually they're going to decide something. What? That's what I'm trying to figure out. She stood, slowly, pocketed the datapad. Senna Marsh is presenting in 4 days. Better than she knows. What's she presenting? Dross smiled then. One of the 3 categories of smile that Vale had ever seen from her. Small, private, satisfied. Not the smile of a person who has won. The smile of a person who has asked a better question than anyone else in the room and is waiting to see if anyone notices. A question, she said. She recorded the briefing notes that night, sitting in the medical bay with the drip line in her arm, and the monitor face down and the door closed. She spoke to the camera for 40 minutes, and she was not inspiring. She was precise. She covered the Tulhari application and the wording required. She covered the limitation motions and the exact diplomatic ground that Marsh needed to hold without appearing to hold it. She covered the Vorath's silence and the 17 things it might mean, and the 3 most likely, and the 1 Marsh should prepare for. Then she said, "Don't let them make you a monument. Monuments don't talk back. Your job is to talk back." She paused, checked the drip line, looked at the ceiling. The point of all of this, the ship, the 40 years, Harak, is not to be the most powerful thing in the room. Any species with enough time can become the most powerful thing in the room. The point is what you do with the room. Another pause. Dara used to say that, my contact on Europa. She meant it about atmospheric systems. She was talking about pressure differentials, and I think she was right about more than that. She stopped the recording. She looked at the datapad. The vote tally was running on a side channel, the conclave's internal vote on the formal protection requests which had been called 3 hours ago, and was still open. Numbers building slowly, species by species, in the careful democratic machinery of a 4,000-year-old institution that was, for the first time in a very long time, voting on something it did not already know the outcome of. She watched the numbers. 4 days later, Senna Marsh stood at the podium in the conclave chamber. It was sized for something 8 feet tall. She was 5'4". She adjusted the microphone. The movement was so similar to Dross's 3 months ago that the Keth attaché, watching from the 3rd ring, made a note of it. She looked at the room. Hundreds of faces, ancient species, 4,000 years of collective history, sitting in chairs and looking back at her. The Vorath delegate with his 7 hands, the breathing membranes in the far left ring, the smell of rain and burning copper. She had prepared a speech, a full speech, structured and sourced, and 3 weeks of work. It was on her datapad. She left it there. She looked at the room, and she said, "What do you want the next 100 years to look like?" Not a statement, not a declaration, not the speech of a species that had just demonstrated what its ship could do and was now dictating terms. A question, sitting in the chamber the way a stone sits in water, creating rings that moved outward and did not stop. The chamber was very quiet. Marsh stood at the podium and did not fill the quiet. She let it sit there and do what it needed to do. In the medical bay, the vote tally was at 91%. The result was visible now, the way a sunrise is visible. Not arrived yet, but clearly coming. Dross watched the numbers. The monitor stayed face down. The tally hit 97%. The screen went dark. 3 seconds before the final count completed, quietly and without drama. As if she simply had other things to attend to, Commander Yale Dross stopped watching. The question was still in the chamber. The room was still answering it. The ship did not look like a weapon anymore. It floated in orbit above a small moon, tethered by 3 maintenance lines, hull plates dull and quiet in the pale starlight. There were no active systems, no weapons hot, no engines burning. A long time ago, something had breathed inside that hull, something enormous and barely contained. Now it just sat there, old and still, the way very powerful things sometimes get to be, if they survive long enough. The school shuttle docked at the port side airlock. 42 children spilled out into the entry corridor, voices bouncing off metal walls that had once carried the sound of battle stations and emergency klaxons. Now the walls carried information plaques in 17 languages. Gift shop at the end of the main corridor. No food or drink past the bridge exhibit. Restrooms near the secondary weapons bay, which had been converted into a small theater showing a 40-minute documentary that most children fell asleep in. The Vorath child's name was Aerith, small even for his age, with the wide pale eyes that Vorath children had before their second growth. He wore a school uniform 2 sizes too big, because his mother believed in buying ahead. He had a notebook tucked under one arm, real paper, an old habit his grandmother had passed to him like a kind of inheritance. He did not understand why this ship was famous. He had read the school materials on the shuttle ride over. He had read them carefully, the way he read everything, but the words had not quite connected into a feeling. A big ship, a battle, a long time ago, people he had never met, making decisions he could not fully picture, in a galaxy that had looked different then, in ways he could not entirely imagine. The guide met them in the entry corridor. She was a human woman, old in the way that humans got old, slowly then all at once. White hair cut short, a small pin on her jacket lapel that meant something to people who knew what it meant. She did not look important. She looked like someone who had decided a long time ago that looking important was a waste of an afternoon. Her name was Tova. She had been giving these tours for 11 years. She looked at the group of children, different species, different sizes, different numbers of eyes, and smiled the way people smile when they are genuinely pleased to see someone, not just performing it. "Welcome to the unconditional," she said. She walked them through the corridors slowly. She did not rush. She stopped at things that did not have plaques, and explained them anyway. A scuff on the wall near the engine room. She told them a story about a junior engineer who had dropped a coolant manifold during the ship's first live fire test and had spent 3 weeks convincing her supervisor it had already been there. A small handprint, barely visible, pressed into a paint patch near the crew quarters. She did not explain that one. She just let them look at it. Arath wrote things in his notebook as they walked. Not everything, just the things that landed differently than the rest. They reached the bridge last. It was smaller than he expected. He had seen images of it, everyone had, but images had a way of making things larger. In person, the bridge was the size of a modest room. Crew stations arranged in a half circle. A captain's chair in the center, that looked ordinary enough to be almost insulting. A wide viewport at the front, and beyond it, the stars. On the wall beside the door, a plaque. UNSS Unconditional. First Titan-class warship. Commissioned in grief. Retired in peace. Arath read it twice. Tova watched him read it. "It doesn't say much," he said. He was not being rude. He was being precise, which was a Vorath quality that humans sometimes mistook for rudeness until they got used to it. "It doesn't. The other plaques have more words. The other plaques were written by committees." She said it without judgment. This one was written by the last captain. Arath looked at the chair. Someone had sat in it. Someone had drunk bad coffee from a thermos and made decisions that changed everything. And then one day had stood up and walked off the ship and not come back, because the ship was done being a warship and needed to become something else. What did it become? Arath asked. Tova told him. After the Conclave Compact, after the politics and the votes and the arguments that took 11 years to resolve, the Titan-class program did not end. It changed. The engineers went back to their drawings and looked at the transformation sequence with different eyes. The second configuration had been built for combat. But the same mechanics that allowed the hull to split and reconfigure and become a weapon could also allow it to become other things. The second Titan-class ship, the UNSS Perseverance, was fitted as a medical platform. In its operational configuration, it could support 100,000 patients simultaneously. It had been deployed to 6 different disaster zones in its first decade. It still was. The third, the UNSS Long Road, was a terraforming vessel. It was currently in the outer edge of a system 300 light-years away, doing work that would not be finished for another 2 centuries. The crew knew they would not live to see it completed. They went anyway. The fourth had no name yet that most people used. Its official designation was UNSS Margin, but the crews of 17 different species who had served aboard it called it something else. A phrase in a trade pidgin that translated approximately to the one that keeps looking. It was an exploration vessel. It had not come home in 30 years. There were 9 Titan-class ships now. 4 of them had never fired a weapon in their operational lives. Then he looked up. "What about the Shul Collective?" he asked. "The ones the Unconditional fought." Tova looked at him for a moment. "They requested membership in the Compact," she said. 14 years after the battle. It took a long time. There were conditions. A lot of conditions. She paused. They met them. Arath wrote that down too, slowly, like he was making sure the pen had enough time to mean it. The rest of the group had moved toward the viewport, pressing faces against the glass to look at the stars. A Keth boy was explaining something to a smaller Dravathi girl in a mix of 3 languages. 2 human children were quietly arguing about something that had nothing to do with history. Arath stayed by the plaque. He looked at the captain's chair one more time. The scuffs on the armrest, the faint discoloration on the left side, where a thermos had sat too many times to count. Were humans always like this? He asked. He did not look at Tova when he asked it. He asked the chair, maybe, or the room, or the ship, which was old enough to remember. Tova thought about it. Not the way people think when they are buying time. The way people think when the question is actually simple, and they are just making sure they have the right words for the answer. No, she said, they had to get there the hard way. Arath wrote it in his notebook. In Vorath, the phrase did not translate cleanly. The closest equivalent was something that meant, roughly, they suffered until they understood what softness costs. He closed the notebook. Outside the viewport, the stars were the same stars that had watched the Unconditional fight. The same stars that had watched it stop fighting and start rescuing. The same stars, indifferent and ancient, that had watched a species climb out of its own wreckage and decide, not once, not easily, and not without argument, what it wanted to do with the thing it had built. On the way back through the corridor, Aerith noticed something he had missed on the way in. The hull plates. Even dormant, even museum quiet, they shifted, barely. A millimeter, maybe less. A slow, rhythmic movement that had no engineering explanation anyone had ever fully committed to paper. He watched them for a long moment. Then he added one more line to his notebook, below the translated quote, in small, careful letters. I think it is still deciding. The shuttle departed an hour later. The Unconditional stayed where it was, tethered and still, hull plates moving in the dark, the way the chest of a sleeping thing moves, slowly, steadily, like something that had earned the right to rest, but had not quite figured out how to stop.